So the Institute of Economic Affairs is a think tank, and our work mostly includes carrying out research and hosting platforms for discussion on public affairs. And the idea is to fulfill our mission of expanding prosperity for Kenyan farms, Kenyan households, Kenyan individuals, and to create a more effective government under which prosperity will prevail in Kenya and in the region. Now, we hold these regular webinars every week or every second week, at which we take topical issues affecting Kenya's economy, and we provide an opportunity for professional input and discussion with the possibility of expanding public education, but to isolate ideas that may be used for reform. So we use these webinars specifically in addition to other publications that we take for public education, but at the same time as a mechanism for listening to various voices and open up chances for informed dialogue. Now, today, we are hosting a conversation discussing Kenya's energy sector. And why is Kenya's energy sector important? Kenya's energy sector is important because based on estimates from the National Bureau of Statistics and the real economy, that is both petroleum and electricity together, if you consolidate that, accounts for close to 2% of Kenya's gross domestic product. So 1 in every 50 shillings of value, or 2 in every 100 shillings of value every year, is contributed by the energy sector comprised of electricity and petroleum. So we think that's a fairly significant question to consider and actually to understand the dynamics of this sector. So that's a first. The second is Kenya's energy costs for industrial input are considered some of the highest in the region. And we're trying to ask ourselves whether some of that high costs relative to Kenya's income levels on account of the dynamics of the sector or not, or whether there is anything that can be done or what we can understand about what those processes are next to. And the third one is just general education about what are the factors that drive, or how does Kenya's energy sector look like? Splitting it into the petroleum sector on one side and the electricity generation sector to understand what it means for the policy initiatives, decarbonization, greening, and obviously Kenya's energy. Kenya's prospects. The final one is that Kenya has an ambitious growth target of 10% of growth under the Vision 2030. Has not been fulfilled, but regardless of that, energy was going to create a very part of the infrastructure setup that is supposed to create a very important drive towards that objective. And so energy consumption at both household and industrial levels will be a significant fact and an important predictors of Kenya's growth and the possibility of achieving the ambitious development aims. So I have two colleagues today, Vivian Ochola and Maureen Barasa, who work under the IEA's program on popular economics program, whose functions are basically to create platforms to discuss this and to generate research that is useful for Kenyans to understand the performance of the economy broadly, and an opportunity to bring government's ideas to a dissection by professionals and to isolate ideas that we can use to push into the policy-making process at all levels. So Vivian Ochola is an assistant program officer at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and Maureen Barasa is a program officer at the Institute of Economic Affairs in the same popular economics program, and they'll be spending the next 45 minutes taking us through the market dynamics in Kenya's energy sector. I would like to inform us all that the IEA, for the purposes of archiving, the IEA records these webinars, and that's just for the purpose of archiving, but also to place a record that can be used for other people who review over time, but at the same time for broader public education beyond the discussion that's available in the next 1.5 hours. So please be informed that we will be recording, and that record will be placed with minimum editing on the IEA's YouTube account for broader public reference. So please note that. Secondly, each of the presenters will have 20 minutes to make a presentation. For the next 40 minutes, we will keep all microphones muted and all cameras switched off, just to enable the presenters to make their presentation, and thereafter, of course, we'll open up for an opportunity for question and answer. In the meantime, as the presentation goes ahead, if you have questions that you'd like to send, please send it through the chat box, which is on the toolbar hanging up. On the top of this facility, and then Those questions will be put together and allow opportunity to ask them for that. But otherwise, we're grateful that you're here, and I'll ask Vivian to proceed with the presentation. Vivian and Maureen, you each have 20 minutes. So please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. So the sources of our information for this analysis is from the biannual energy, petroleum statistical reports for the financial year 2024-2025. So all our data is taken from this particular report. So this is basically the outline. We look at the market testing methods. We have a couple, but our focus for this analysis will be on the structural measures. Then we'll narrow it down to concentration, HHI and 4CR. Then we'll have the background for each subsector within the energy sector. Then we'll have the recommendations and the conclusions. And now for the structural measures. So just as I've said, we have two ways of testing for a market, and you have that is the structural measures and also the behavioral or the conduct measures. But for this analysis, we'll focus on the structural measures. This is because structural measures shows how the market delivers welfare. That is why our focus will be on the structural measures. And under these measures, we have three of them, and that is barrier to entry. There's dynamic structural measures. We have concentration. Then under barrier, what determines whether a market is having barriers to entry is regulatory barriers. So that basically shows some of the regulatory measures that hinders a particular firm to enter a given market. Then also the initial cost of entry, it is also a barrier. The initial cost of entry is high. It is a barrier to entry for a particular market. Then we have the dynamic structural measures. This basically shows the entry and exit rates. So if we have a market whereby the entry and exit rate is high, it shows that that market is competitive, and also the average of firms will be able to show the structure of that particular market, whether it is competitive or it is a monopoly. Then for the concentration, we have two measures that are used, and we have the HHI and the four-firm concentration ratio. So for this analysis, we'll focus on the two, the HHI and also the four-firm concentration ratio. Now, for the HHI analysis, this is the interpretation. So when you have the percentage market share, you square the percentage market share of the different firms within a particular subsector. Then when their sum is at 0, that shows it is a perfect market. When the sum of the squares is at 5,000, that is at the middle, it shows that market is a duopoly, which implies it is dominated by two firms. When it is at 10,000, it basically shows that that market is a monopoly. So for example, if we have one market that dominates the entire market, when it has got a percentage share of 100, it is a monopoly. Then we'll see what happens when we have between perfect and a duopoly. When it comes to 4CR, you take the first four firms, their market share, then you sum them up. If the ratio or if the sum is above 50% or above 60%, it shows that the market is highly concentrated at the top. So it implies that the first four markets dominates or have a greater percentage share as compared to the remaining market. So we'll use these analysis or testing methods for both the subsectors within the energy sector. Now, we have two subsectors within the energy, and I'll be taking you through the electricity subsector. For the electricity, this is the background. So the background basically shows us what is composed within the electricity subsector. So it is a section that basically provides the general overview of the electricity supply chain. It focuses on generation, transmission, and distribution. So we know generation is the process of producing electricity from different sources, and we have a couple of sources from geothermal all the way to thermal. Then transmission is basically moving electricity in high voltage, and it is generally the work of KETRACO. It is the main and the sole transmitter of electricity. And distribution, we have Kenya Power and Lighting Company, which is the sole distributor of electricity. So from this background, we are able to notice some things. For the generation, there are diverse companies or diverse methods of generating electricity in Kenya. When it comes to transmission, we realize that there's only one and main sole transmitter of electricity in Kenya. And one thing we'll be able to notice even as we continue, KETRACO is owned by government. When it comes to KPLC, the distribution aspect of it, it is also one sole licensed distributor of electricity, and it is also owned by the government. So we are able to understand that electricity is a private good. When it comes to generation, we have diverse sources, but for the transmission and distribution, it is the government that is owning the companies that transmit and also distribute. So towards the end, we'll be able to understand what is the effect of that when it comes to now regulation and how the market structure should work. Now let us see the supply side of electricity. So table 1 basically shows the installed capacity of electricity as of December 2024. So the first column just shows the technology that is used in generating electricity in Kenya, and we have hydro, geothermal, thermal, wind, all the way to WHRC. So it has got diverse sources. Then column 2 shows the interconnected capacity as of December 2024. And you are able to notice we have installed and effective. So the difference is that installed is basically what the infrastructure could hold given a perfect condition. Then when it comes to effective is what was actually available at the time of generation because of different reasons like weather and all others. So we are able to notice when it comes to hydro, the installed versus effective, it is not that much, but about 29.3 were not effective but installed. When it comes to geothermal, just a few percentage. But when you look at solar, all the installed capacity was effective, likewise to bioenergy and also imports. Then we look at the third column, that is captive capacity. It shows captive capacity basically shows the additional power by private people, but it is power that is consumed within, but it is not in the national or part of the national grid. And we are able to notice for solar and bioenergy, most of its energy is captive capacity. It's owned by private people. Then we have the off-grid, now the total, which includes both column 2 all the way to column 4. Then for the total installed, we are able to notice that geothermal is leading at 26.13. Then we have hydro at 24.16, all the way down to WHRC at 2.13. So some of the takeaways or some of the things we need to take out from this table, we're able to notice that electricity generation in Kenya is diverse. So there are a couple of technologies that generate electricity in Kenya. Then it is also, we're able to notice that there's no dominant technology. From the total percentage, there's no technology that is twice more than the other. There's no technology that is dominant. Then we're able to notice that other than thermal, which includes petroleum that is imported, and the exports, the imports, we are able to notice that all the sources, the remaining sources are domestic, they are internal. So that is about 82.64% are internal sources. Then another thing, other than geothermal and other than thermal, we are able also to notice that the sources are carbon-free. They are pure or clean sources of energy. So in Kenya, at the point of generation, the sources of energy are non-carbon or they are clean sources. Thank you. Now on the demand side, we are able to, this table 2 now shows the demand side, who consumes the electricity. We have noticed how it is generated, what percentage is generated and how. Now we want to understand who consumes this electricity. So from table 2, we are able to notice on the first column, it shows the customer category, or from industrial all the way to e-mobility. Then second column shows the energy consumption in gigawatts. Then we have the percentage. So we are able to notice from this on the consumption side, it shows that industrial has got 51.18%. Then when it comes to domestic, it is at 31.51%. Then small commercial at 16, street lighting at 0.81. Then we have mobility at 0.03. So for electricity consumption in Kenya, we're able to say that industrial is dominant in consumption. It consumes above 50%, sorry, of the produced electricity. So this can be attributed to the fact that industrial consumption or industry use heavy machines that require a lot of energy. So we are able to conclude from this that the supply of electricity is highly dependent on industrial consumption. Then from the data, though it's not included here, it showed that as of December 2024, there were 9.9 billion customers that were connected to electricity overall. That includes all the categories. So as of December 2024, there were 9.9 customers that were using electricity in Kenya. Now let us go to the supply side. So we looked at the supply side, at the generation side. Now we are going to look at the specific companies that generate electricity and their market share, so that we'll be able to identify whether in electricity market, is it competitive or not. So when we look at individual companies, we have diverse companies from KenGen all the way to others. They are diverse. Then that is on the first column. Then we have the second column that shows the energy generated in terms of gigawatts. Then from July all the way to December 2024. Then we have the column of market share that shows for 2023 and 2024. But for this analysis, we are going to focus on the latest, which is July to December 2024. So we are able to notice that from table 3, KenGen has a percentage market share of 59.94%. So it is, the percentage is higher. It dominates the market with a higher percentage. Then it is followed, not very closely, with imports at 10.48. Then we have Lake Turkana at 10, all the way to others at 5.112. Others can include a couple of companies that are they were summed up together. So from this, we are able to notice that if we remove, for example, if there were no imports, KenGen will still dominate the market, and it will now have a higher percentage, having about 59.4 over 89.52%. That's a higher percentage. But we are able to notice, since there are imports allows help to moderate the dominance of this particular market. So from this market share, we'll be able to calculate the HHI and also the 4CR, so that we don't just talk from theory, but we'll be able to see what does the index or the HHI tells us, and the four farm concentration ratio tells us about this market, and from that we'll be able to identify whether this market is competitive or not based on the analysis. So we can next slide. So we did the analysis for the HHI for the electricity market. When you square all the market share, then you sum them up, it summed to 3,891. So if you can recall from the second slide, we showed how to interpret that. So if it is close to 0, it is a perfect market. If it is close to 10,000, it is a monopoly. If it is 5,000, it's a duopoly. For this, you are able to notice it is between a duopoly and a perfect market. It is there between. So the market is far from a perfect market or a monopoly, but is close to a duopoly. Then when it comes to 4CR, when you add the percentage share of the first 4 firms, it shows that the 4 main players have a share of 86.4%. So the conclusions we are making is that the market is an oligopolistic market. This shows that there are few players in the market that have a greater percentage share. Then it is highly concentrated at the top. So we are seeing that the first 4 firms has a higher percentage of 86%. So the first 4 firms alone has got a greater percentage. So it shows that the market is concentrated at the top. Then we are able to conclude also that KenGen is a dominant player. It has got a percentage of 59.9%, which is a higher percentage as compared to the next player at 10%. Now, the recommendations. So one of the recommendations is that we need to allow the government should allow easy entry and exit of the markets from both internal and external players. So just as we have seen, if imports are eliminated, or if there are no imports, for example, we are able to see that the dominance of KenGen is higher. So when markets are allowed to enter and also exit freely, or it will help to moderate the dominance of a particular market. And when there's a competition within a particular market, one thing we're able to notice that when there's competition, it implies that there will be fair as well, and also the market will be tending towards equilibrium that provides surplus for both consumer and the supplier. Then another thing is that the government influence on KenGen and KPLC affect the structural dynamic of the market. So we noticed from the background that government owns KenGen and also a share of KenGen and also KPLC and KETRACO. So these affect, remember, when the government owns and it is also the regulator, it becomes very difficult and it ends up affecting the structure, because we know in a perfect market, what should happen is that the farm or the suppliers should be the price takers. But when it comes to the point where the government is the one regulating and also its own, for its benefit, it can to some extent control the prices and also affect the dynamic structure of a particular market. Then that can result to bias in regulation, especially when this ownership structure remains the same. Because as a owner of that particular, their interest could be profit making, and since they want more profits, it will be difficult to regulate in a given way that helps the consumers or that favors the consumers. It will always be favoring themselves because they are both the regulator and also the suppliers. So it is important that the government should reduce its influence and probably, if possible, to privatize, because we have realized electricity is a private good. So it should be better for it to even privatize the the companies so that it only works in regulation, but leave the markets to market forces to determine the prices within electricity sector. Thank you. So I'll welcome my colleague to continue with the petroleum subsector.
Thank you. We've already looked at the electricity subsector. Now we'll be looking into the petroleum subsector, and just a brief overview of the petroleum subsector. For the petroleum subsector, fuel prices are determined by the landing cost. We have the landing cost, the distribution and storage cost, and we have the suppliers' margins that are set by the government. Then we have the taxes and levies, and also the demurrage costs and margins accrued by the oil and marketing companies. So the demurrage cost, this is mainly a charge payable to the owner of a chartered ship on failure to load or discharge the ship within the time agreed. So also on the 14th day of every month, the Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority computes these costs and publishes the monthly prices for PMS, that is the Premium Motor Spirit, then AGO, that is the Automotive Gas Oil, basically that's diesel, and the IK, which is the Illuminating Kerosene. Yeah, EPRA is the one that computes and publishes these prices on a monthly basis, the 14th. So we can see EPRA's major role in price setting in the petroleum subsector. And it is worth noting that petroleum is externally sourced. Most of it is externally sourced. And therefore, if we have global shocks, say wars and also the foreign exchange effects, petroleum prices are majorly affected, and this is also considered in the computing by EPRA on the landing cost end. Yeah, to get the final price. So moving forward, we look at table 4, which shows the market share of oil marketing companies as of December 2024. And on the left, that shows different companies that are involved in these petroleum markets, then the total sale in metric tons for the different products. Then on the last column shows the percentage share in the market. And from this, we can see that the top 3 farms, that is Vivo Energy Kenya, Rubis, and Total Energies, have more than 50% of the market share. Then from this distribution from Vivo Energy being the largest player in the market, all the way to others, and others these are just different small oil and marketing companies that have been computed as a whole to get others, which is 14.98%. And from this, we can see that this is a fairly diverse market structure. The oil and marketing companies. Then in table 5, we have the 4 farm concentration ratio as of December 2024. This data is just taken from this table. This table is from EPRA. Then we calculated the 4 farm concentration ratio for the top 4 companies, that is Vivo Energy, Rubis, Total, and Ola Energy. And the 4 farm concentration for these top 4 farms in the oil and marketing companies is 56.25%. That is the market share. And this just shows it's a diverse market. It signals a competitive market in the petroleum subsector. Then table 6, it's just our own calculation for the HHI index. On the first column, it just shows the different players, that is the companies, then the percentage share in the market for the different players. Then in computing the HHI, we just square, and that is on the last column. And at the bottom of our table, that is the HHI, it's equal to 1,229.79. And if you can remember from slides shown by my colleague Vivian, if it lies towards 0 on that scale, on that line graph, it shows that it's a near perfect market. So a HHI of 1,229.79 shows it lies towards perfect markets. Then this is just a computation, or rather a chart showing the HHI index for downstream petroleum from July to December 2024. And this is a calculation by the Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority. And the yellow line shows the target. Then you have the green line showing the HHI. Then the purple shows the cumulative market share for top 3 players. So on our right, that is the HHI, and also that's what we use to read the HHI and the target. And on the left, it's used to read the cumulative market share for the top 3 players. Yes, if you can remember, the top 3 players were Vivo, Rubies, and Total Energies. So this is just a calculation by EPRA. And from this calculation, it shows the HHI by EPRA for the top 3 players was slightly above the target, that is 0.1. It was at around 0.104, thereabouts, for the top 3 players. Their target of 0.1, that is like 1,000, which they were targeting a perfect market for the petroleum industry, but it's almost there at the perfect market. And our interpretation of this, yes, they're trying to measure the HHI through this, and it's like they're giving themselves credit for this because they're the price setters in this case. They're the ones setting the prices for the different suppliers using the computations that we've explained, the landing cost, storage, taxes, levies, and all that to compute the final price for this. So by calculating the HHI for this market, it's like they're marking their own exams, and the price itself is not determined by independent suppliers and consumers because the price has already been determined in this case. Then for recommendations in the petroleum subsector, we recommend for increased consumer supplies because if price setting occurs, it tends to increase the producer surplus because the government sets a certain price after considering all these factors. So the consumer in this case, the surplus has been reduced, and also government intervention in prices by EPRA playing the role of a price setter. Yes, in economic theory, it's recommended that farms should be price takers instead of price setters. But they're already price setters by EPRA playing a huge role in setting the prices. And also the petroleum market is, the intervention also in the petroleum market is not required. Recently in August 2025, the National Oil Corporation partnered with Ruby's Energy, and Ruby's Energy is supposed to take 30% of sales in this partnership. So in this case, the government being the regulator and also sitting in the governance for this National Oil Corporation of Kenya, as well as Ruby's partnership, it presents a bias in terms of regulation and also price setting. And in this case, the consumer supplies will always be reduced. And also it will not allow for fair play for other oil and marketing companies. And also the tax effect on prices. If the government increases maybe taxes and levies and also increases the supplier margin, it increases petroleum prices, and this has an outpouring effect on other things that require petroleum in their day-to-day operations, for instance, manufacturing, and it also affects all the way to food prices. So there's a huge effect on prices of other things that are involved with petroleum. And also the government should instead observe the conduct of farms. We've seen cases of adulteration of fuel, among other things. So instead of government trying to be a price setter, they should observe the conduct of farms involved in these in oil and marketing operations. Yeah, and also we note that setting up a petrol station in itself is capital intensive. So the government should not in any way be involved in price setting, but allow for different companies to compete equally. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
All right. Thanks a lot to Maureen and Vivian. So let me try and summarize what my colleagues have stated. So first, I think the function of the conversation today was to ask ourselves, what are some of the structural dynamics based on basic metrics of the energy sector in Kenya? And we're simply asking ourselves, well, this is a large sector in comparative terms, modern sources of energy being electricity on one side and petroleum fuels constitute close to 2% of Kenya's GDP. So looking at what's happening here is essential. In addition to the fact that these are connected to Kenya's long-term growth forecasts and long-term growth ambition. So that's quite an important part. But also because in both sectors, the government of Kenya plays very, very large roles. I mean, those roles are decisive for what the structure and the markets look like. So then we go to electricity, and Vivian tells us that, look, if you look at electricity, there's very diverse generation sources in the sense that not only in terms of sources from hydro, thermal sources, wind power, and geothermal, the very wide sources. So that's the first thing. There's solar as well, and of course there's importation. So Kenya in 2024 had very diverse sources of energy, and that's necessarily a good thing. Why? Because it prevents dependence, but it also shows that the power structure is fairly, energy provision structure is fairly diverse, so that there's not significant dependence on one side, and obviously for energy security. So that's one generation of supply. Most of those sources, as you see them as well, again, tracing what you said, are non-carbon sources. So Kenya's electricity generation, as it stood in 2024, was actually admirable. Perhaps a world leader for being, or rather for exhibiting non-carbon sources, because hydropower, geothermal, of course, which is the largest, there's solar power, and you can see as well wind power. So fairly solid on the generation part, being safer or less polluting sources. And then we have thermal power, and thermal power is itself significant, but basically it comes from petroleum. So it's both imported, and therefore, of course, has a foreign exchange component to it. On the demand side, you see that it is moderated by income, but 51% of energy demand at the end of 2024 was by industry, basically. So that would be manufacturing and industrial development. I mean, which is significant. And then, of course, another 30 or thereabouts is appropriated by Kenyan households. Not 20% is appropriated by Kenyan households. So it's telling you that the two largest, about 80% comes from industry, which is farms, and obviously about 20% from households. So the demand side shows that industry actually calls or demands a high sector. And this is significant because the prices of energy, which many firms in Kenya say is a significant barrier to global competitiveness in exports, are determined by prices. And in both sides of the households, it's moderated by incomes. And Kenya's energy consumption on a per capita basis is actually very, very low. So here is a country with 14 million houses, 14 million households, closing 14 million households, at the same time with about 100,000 businesses of different kinds registered at the business services. And there are only 9 million accounts, including both commercial businesses and households. So obviously there's some space to be made, but I think the major barrier here is an income barrier. So electricity, in whichever way we think about it, we have to think about how it provides new income opportunities, of which exports would be important, and how it helps other small commercial and households to get better incomes as well. So it's mediated by income. But there's a huge role in government on both the supply side, especially on the supply side, in regulation, and government sets electricity tariffs. So it owns some of the generation assets, and at the same time, government agencies are involved in regulation through the Energy, Petroleum and Regulatory Authority. So that, in our view, places the government in a very significant place, in a very interesting place, because it straddles both as an owner of assets at the same time, taking commercial value on one side, and at the same time, dispassionately, to the extent that that is possible, dispassionately regulating the sector. We think that's an interesting ownership, or rather model, and it actually has impact on the side on the prices of electricity in Kenya, and in general on the surplus in the sector itself, because prices set necessarily means that that the main assets are not necessarily price takers, in as much as EPRA itself determines our price on the tariff on a year by year or on a regular basis. So that's an important role which government has a role in price setting. On the petroleum supply side, again, we saw that the supply sources are very diverse, especially at the dealership levels. So OMCs are very, very many. The largest barely have a market share of about 21 or 22%. So at the same time, obviously, on the petroleum energy side, there's diverse, and there's a huge diverse demand. Of course, is more distributed as well. But on the whole, you see that in the petroleum sector, it's a very, very diverse set, so that you have close to, as the HHI showed us, close to 1,000, basically the Hashman Affindal index on the supply side. So that would suggest that it's a really, really competitive market structure. All good. I think supply in Kenya has also been very stable. Very rarely do you see shortages and that, which is also good. But we have a problem in the sense that prices are still set by the Electricity and Petroleum Regulatory Authority. And looking at the fact that there's a very diverse set of the distribution of dealerships with different sizes of cost, based on barely 21%, it challenges the need to continue to say that there's a justification for price control. Because if they were that diverse, then obviously the competition should do the rest. And so while the competition, the index shows that it's very, very competitive, both from the four-farm concentration ratio measurement and from the Hashman and Affindal index, suggesting that it's much closer to the competitive side. We still have the energy regulation, again, on behalf of the Republic of Kenya, doing regulation, but not just technical regulation on licensing, but also determining price. And I think there's a tension here about what actually is being achieved. If the market has significant players in and out, and they're able to compete, there's no competition that is actually happening right now if the price has already been set. Especially, we understand that the price that has been set is the ceiling. But still, notwithstanding that, the signal that comes from government that they've determined what the price is and what the margins are is a very interesting one. And actually, it's a conundrum for how you justify trying to drive competition, because the Energy, Petroleum and Regulatory Authority itself has a benchmark, which is set for its preferred threshold for the Hashman Affindal index, which is 0.1 at about 100 or thereabouts. And at the same time, on the other side, determining price. Now, you might claim that that determination of price is what has led to fairly favorable competitive outcomes. But if the competitive outcomes have been achieved, then we ask ourselves whether the role in terms of price setting is still relevant. And our view at least as suggested by the basic data presented by my colleagues is, I don't think it is. But we understand the regulatory incentive of a regulatory body to continue to advance and to creep. So really surrendering that price setting role, in my view, is very, very is unlikely to happen for all political economy reasons and public choice reasons. And what all this brings us to the fact that this energy sector, 2% of Kenya's GDP for the clean energy side, I know that Kenyans consume energy as well from biosources, more specifically from biomass. But this is a life sector, it's a modern sector, it's connected to the other sectors of the economy and important for Kenya's growth. I think government's hand in our view still seems to be very large. And we are asking ourselves whether I think there's a case for regulatory policy reform about what the role should be played, given the dynamics that are reflected. We know this is a one-time, static analysis, but I think all the reports published by the EPRA seem to show that this has been fairly stable on both the regulatory side, on energy, electricity side, and on the crude petroleum side. So some regulatory policy reform is required, where regulatory policy or regulatory authorities should, I think, step back from price controls or price setting, because it's the same thing regardless, whether suggestive or not, either tariff setting or government should completely leave and let the farms in these sectors to be entirely run. I remember that we could actually have a different claim for whether transmission assets and distribution assets could still be held in the course of one farms. But you can also tell that on the transmission side, Ketraco, a government interstate corporation, with the development of the grid, the electricity grid is still a monopoly, and there might be justification for keeping that for a country such as Kenya or for regional purposes. And then obviously the distribution, which is owned by KPLC, also partly owned by government, with huge interference from government in terms of determining board decisions and other policies. All this is something that's in. And 30 years after Kenya's regulatory reform started in 1990, the mid-90s to today, it's very, very clear to us that government needs to systematically exit. And if it chooses to, they're straddling both ownership of assets at the same time as determining prices and doing the technical regulatory control. Tells us, I think, the time to move entirely towards technical regulatory control. Technical regulatory policy or management is the proper role for government in both these sectors. That's my sorry, I took much more time than I should have, but I was trying to summarize as neatly as I can. So now we're going to open up this conversation to, let me check. I haven't seen a question on the chat box, but I'd like to open this session now for any questions that you may have for my colleague Maureen and Vivian. So if you raise your hands by, at the top of your toolbar is a toolbar, at the top of your screen is a toolbar, and you can either raise your hands or type in a question and I'll try and read them. So let me hear any questions. I haven't seen anybody's hands up. Let's raise it, and any questions on this will be sent back to Maureen and Vivian for answer. I thank them for the presentation. Thank you. Can I have questions? There are 28 of us in the conversation. Please let me hear your questions. Any question? All right. Let me ask them questions as they think here. Oh, okay, fine. There's a question by Ben Onyango. Ben Onyango has his hands up. So Ben, I'll please unmute yourself and ask your question. If you can switch on your microphone, your camera as well, so that we see you as you ask the question. Introduce yourself, then you can ask your question and make your comment. Thanks. Ben, go ahead.
Hey, I don't think the camera bit is necessary. It's okay. My name is Ben, and I am an electrical engineer. So transmission and distribution is actually my specialty. So my question is, looking at what we have in Kenya in terms of the market share, and the previous presenters highlighted that the government has a significant role in in transmission, distribution, and generation. And then the point is also highlighted there that the government needs to, for better word, take a step back and allow private players to come on board to ensure that the market is perfect. So my question is, So in terms of, let's say, if we look at distribution, what kind of policies would you, based on your own experience looking at the economy of Kenya and how it has been playing all along, what kind of policies or subsidies would attract private entity to come in and fight it off, for lack of a better word, with KPLC? That's one. Two, in terms of generation and not generation, but distribution, not distribution, sorry, transmission. We have Ketraco as the main or the asset owner and also the system operator there. What kind of policies would govern a private public-private partnership entering into this and providing maybe better services in terms of maybe transmission? Yeah,
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. Thanks for that. Oh, sorry, I hope you're not, I didn't interrupt you. Please go ahead.
No, that's all.
Thank you very much, Ben. So yes, my colleagues will answer that. Do I have any other questions? Let me check the chat box. No, there's none. So Vivian, please respond to the question from Ben. And if Maureen wants to chime in as well, please go ahead. His question was, there were two questions actually. So he says we look at Kenya in terms of the distribution of market share that we've illustrated here from the data from the EPRA. What do we think are some of the distribution policies that would attract a private sector firm to come in and compete with KPLC based on the dynamics that you've demonstrated? So that's the first question for KPLC side. And then on transmission, he also asked what kind of policies would govern, should be in place for PPPs to provide better services, to ensure that Ketraco provides better services. And there's another question by Joan Onyango in the chat box, so I'll read it so that both of you can respond. He says, in your research, why is it difficult to get distribution of electricity in Kenya? Why is it difficult to get distribution? Okay, well, yes. So she's asking, what are the impediments to the distribution of electricity throughout Kenya? I think that's a good question as well. So it seems like most of our questions so far on electricity. So I'll start with you, Vivian, and then you can, I'll open up to Maureen as well to add whatever she may want to add before we go in for the next set of questions. So let's start with Vivian. Please switch on your camera.
Now, one of the things we can notice or we must notice from that is that when it comes to generation, transmission, and distribution of electricity, they are capital intensive. They are very much capital intensive, making the initial cost of entry very high, even for the private sectors to enter that particular subsector. Now, when it comes to the policies, some of the policies can be establishing an independent regulator with a clear predicting roles. Remember, we have understood that the government is the regulator when it comes to generation all the way to distribution of electricity. So for it to attract private sectors, there should be clarity when it comes to, or certainties and transparency when it comes to regulation. And also, since it is the government that set the tariffs and all that, so there should be tariff reforms and also cost reflective pricing. So with pricing, the prices should cater in for the cost or the initial cost for that particular for either generation, transmission, or distribution. Then another policy that can be encouraged because of the heavy initial cost of transmission or of joining the market, there should be an encouragement of public-private partnership. So this will help to share the risk within the private and also the public sectors. So the government role should shift from being a dominant player also or a dominant supplier to being a facilitator and a guarantor for the competition to take place and also to allow for private sectors to come into the company. So that is the response I have for that.
All right, thank you. Maureen, do you have any other questions? I mean, any responses?
Yeah, just to add to that, yeah, you've asked about policies for distribution and policies for public-private partnerships. If we track back to government's role is in providing public goods, and electricity itself is a private good. So through the whole presentation for both the electricity subsector as well as the petroleum subsector, we've given recommendations for government to allow for entry and exit for private sector, and also the government role in the two subsectors. So yeah, we understand that both of them are capital intensive sectors, and also it requires probably proper and expensive infrastructure for setting up both and running both. So perhaps policy should involve maybe easy entry and exit, as well as government's role in taxation, as well as licensing in this, reduce maybe the burden that it comes with entry into these markets, and also to reduce dominance of certain firms, and also government's role in especially the conflict of interest in regulation, as well as being the sole generator, distributor, or transmitter, and also regulation in these subsectors, and also the impediment to distribution of electricity in Kenya. I think that's majorly an income issue. Yes, because the government might, yeah, we remember the rural electrification program. Yes, the government distributed the electricity to different households, but the returns were not that sufficient for the government, because it was majorly an income issue, but people could not be able to afford this. And yeah, to some extent, the government went at a loss. So I think the impediment is majorly an income issue for the citizenry. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, let me see if I have other questions as well. And let me add on the question of, I think, yes, Ben's question really is important. So Ben, it depends, in my view, again, not to contradict my colleagues, but my view is that I think in Kenya, we think that the traditional, distribution is more amenable to competition than transmission, because transmission lines, the national grid, we call it the national grid, for a country of this size, and Kenya is not a small country. I think we're the 38th largest country by land size, 38th or 40th. But by land size, it's not a small country. It's the top 25% of all biggest countries in the world. So sometimes competition in grid formation, in grid creation, actually comes with the size of the country. So in a place like the US and other bigger countries, sometimes it does. Of course, again, in other countries such as India, it's all consolidated in a government function. So it depends. But if the size is big, because of course there are fixed costs to transmission, then obviously it could be distributed and create regional power companies and regional transmission pools. And connect them as, of course, an engineer, you understand, they can be connected. So that's possible. So we don't think that in transmission in Kenya can. I think the transmission in Kenya could be actually fastened if more PPPs were allowed to transmission infrastructure, the grid could be fastened if the more PPPs were allowed to allow that transmission to the grid to be expanded independently among the construction farms in different places, so that the farms that lay grid don't necessarily have to follow one plan. There could be a national plan, and then it could be passed out to each and every one of them, so that it can happen concurrently. So that's possible. On distribution, I think distribution could also follow a geographical field, so that basically you can have distribution in certain geographical places allow for competition, and that happens. And we know that in places like, again, another small country such as the UK, distribution can be geographically competitive by simply saying whoever is able to push in power into the grid at a specific area at a specific time would be allowed to distribute in specific places. And that distribution models would allow for competition for one person to choose whether to distribute in one place, so that you keep the competitive the urge for competition alive, and therefore generate benefits both for the supply side and the demand side of the market. So that's one of the things that we think. So yes, I understand. I think as an energy engineer, you are reminding us about the difficulties. So yes, there's more possibility for competition on the distribution side, and given Kenya's size, perhaps the distribution part might be, the transmission part might still have to be owned by the government of Kenya as a transmission. Though, of course, it could also be a private company, to be honest, a private company, but it would probably be more monopoly. It's less likely to be competitive, partly because the size the country is small, and obviously the grid has fixed costs. Once you have a grid, the possibility of having a competing grid will not be necessarily possible. So the technical specifications could be provided by EPRA, and a farm could allow, and I think that's what happens, be allowed to do that in the transmission side as happens. So we think that for that, the logic is still sound, but on the distribution side, the idea of keeping KPLC as the monopoly distributor is one that I think Kenya's market dynamics suggest doesn't have to be so. Yeah, so I guess that's open start. Now, on Joanne, you asked a question about why it is difficult to get distribution license of electricity. Yes, I think that part of that might be also the regulatory model that has been chosen, and some of it is also just political. I think in our country, there's the belief that these assets owned belong to government, and therefore it is safer to have them in government hands for strategic reasons. Whether that's just political argument, the economics of it is certainly not true. But yes, part of it is just basically that the Ministry of Energy and the policy in general is to try as much as possible. And remember, government was an interest in KPLC because government is a much major owner of KPLC, in as much as, of course, there's privatization as well. But we all know that this farm was originally privatized prior to independence. And then it was taken back by the public, I think sometime in 1980s, when government bought it back. The KPLC was actually largely privatized, and some of its owners actually were not even in Kenya. There were farms based in London and other places. Might have been based on the legacy of Kenya's independence and colonialism. But regardless of that, it was run as a private enterprise, and then, of course, government increased its shareholding to be a majority sometime in the mid-80s, based on a political calculation, not entirely. So yes, there's a precedent that if it was privatized, it is possible that other private farms could be allowed, especially on generation and specific areas, and there's good evidence for that. So both economic reasons, which is the incentive to keep government shareholding in KPLC, keep its value, a monopoly shows that, and then the other one might just be political questions, which could be covered through the arguments of security and national interest. I'll open up again for the second round of questions. Any other? Let me see if there's no question in the chat. Can I have any other questions? If you'd ask them to explain a chart or to anything else that you think this conversation should have covered that you don't see or is not clear, this is the moment to ask, because it looks like we are in the final round of our questions before we close. Any other question? Okay, I see no question. So basically what I'll ask is, this time I'll reverse the order of conversation and ask, oh yes, there's one. There's one. There's Wairimu Manyara is here and she'd like to ask a question. So Wairimu, please, yes, please ask your question, unmute yourself and ask your question. And if you could direct it to a specific person, that would even be better. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I really enjoyed this webinar. I think great insights, particularly on, just tangible recommendations on how to improve the sector in general. I think just noting some of the things you've stated, that the fact that some of the constraints in our energy sector are not necessarily at the generation level, right? So it's not that Kenya really needs to dramatically expand or, go beyond our current energy mix, but we need to update our infrastructure, particularly in terms of transmission and distribution. So I heard you mention that privatization would be one of the best ways, for example, to be able to develop our transmission infrastructure. But I think we saw what happened last year, with the Adani deal and everything. But my question particularly is, to what extent do you see subnational governments, like Nairobi County, for example, then being able to take on such, such functions of national government, like, for example, in terms of transmission or distribution, for Nairobi to be able to meet its residents' demands, as opposed to just privatization, but also leveraging the devolution structure towards increasing energy efficiency in Kenya. But yeah, that's just my question. I'm from the Just Energy Transition Initiative Africa, so we work on renewable energy policy. I'm happy to be here. I really enjoyed the webinar.
Thank you very much, Werimo. Thanks a lot, and thanks for the compliments. We appreciate it when these webinars are useful. So we are grateful that you got and you asked some serious questions, which I'll ask my colleagues to deal with. So there are two questions for Maureen and Vivian. One of those is Werimo, is that is there a possibility that subnational governments could actually have a role? And you gave the example of Nairobi and in the distribution, and rather in the generation and distribution parts. And then you also spoke about, you reminded us to be alert to the risks that come with trying to privatize. And you specifically responded to, referred to a real case, and I think it's important for all policy discussions to be based on the reality of the Adani question last year. Yes. So my colleagues will answer that. I have my own comments, but since they're the ones making the conversations, I think you asked us to be alert to those risks, and I'd like to hear you as well. Now, there's a comment from Isaac, and Isaac says, thanks for the research and discussions. I look forward to research and discussions on water and sanitation sector in Kenya, the tariffs and the institution frameworks. Thanks, Isaac. So let me go to, because I haven't seen any other questions, and we don't want to delay you beyond the 12:30 that we spoke about. So I'll ask Vivian to respond to the questions from Irene, and then make your closing remarks, and Maureen as well, and then we'll close. We'll close so that we allow everybody to leave. We observe the time that we'd actually committed to this conversation. So let's start with you, Vivian.
Thank you for that question. So basically, transmission lines are normally a national mandate, though counties can make the sector more attractive by probably removing local barriers, but makes it not effective or within the county levels, and also for financing when it comes to last mile distributions, then also promoting the off-grid solution. So it can help in certain section, but one thing we need to know that transmission lines are generally a national mandate, but they can come in and help in such removing local barriers and also promoting off-grid solutions. So that is just an attempt to that. My colleagues will expand on that. Now, when it comes to my concluding remarks, one thing we have noted is that there's government influence on the energy sector, and for a market to work well and also to be competitive, there should be a reduction in the influence of the government in that particular market, and it should only come when there's a market failure for intervention. So when a market is open, one thing we need to understand is it helps competition. When it is open and it is competitive, it is close to equilibrium, and when a market is close to equilibrium, it shows that the price is also close to equilibrium price that provides a larger surplus for the consumers. So in as much as intervention is necessary, regulation is necessary, but a market should be left to operate, and the forces of supply and demand should be left to determine the prices and not the government determining the prices of a particular market. Yeah, thank you.
All right, Maureen.
Thank you. Just to sort of add to begin on the county government's help in transmission of electricity. Yeah, I think if we look at the constitution, yeah, on the roles and functions of the county government as well as the national government, county government is restricted to certain roles. I think maybe they can help in maintenance of street lighting. Yeah. And there was a suggestion on water and sanitation. Yeah. Okay, if we happen, okay, we'll be having more webinars. If we happen to have that, yeah, of course, we'll have a discussion around that. Just to conclude, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for attending the webinar. And yeah, we've been looking at competition and the government's role in different markets. We previously looked at the ICT sector and yeah, majorly on the telecommunication sector. And we saw government's role in governance for some companies as well as its regulatory role. And today we are looking at the energy sector and government's role as well. It limits competition, as Vivian says, and yeah, we are sort of we are big on the law of supply and demand, trying to regulate prices in the market and allowing for competition in different markets and limited government role in different markets to allow for increased consumer surplus. Yeah, thank you so much for attending the webinar and have a nice afternoon.
All right, thanks a lot. Yes, so let me respond to Werinu's question about, I think you've alerted us to the fact that yes, we ought not to take for granted that the engagement of a private sector firm or a firm that claims to be private sector, especially in grid development or any sector in the energy sector, is necessarily superior, because you reminded us that we have to mention names by the Adani question, obviously. I think there's a possibility of government or regulatory capture, that one person comes and floats a proposal which a government department takes for the without public scrutiny and without transparency. So yes, and I think this answers both to Ben and you, that I think Kenya's electricity and energy sector in general is too important. Government has big roles as both a supplier, especially from the supply side, and also from the regulatory side, setting prices. For that reason, transparency in the conduct of the regulatory function of these of government institutions is essential. And so the Adani one tells you, regardless of the outcomes, that obviously anytime some of these things are hidden, and they tend to be hidden by people who are apologetic for government by saying, look, these are national security questions, they're assets of the national government, and let's deal with them in this way, leads us to what we call that stink in the Adani, whether it's the airport one or the construction and the transmission lines, which we all know is ongoing. And who pays for that? It's the taxpayers, definitely, and the consumer. So in this way, while we can give government powers here and there, I think the absence of transparency leads to harm to both the taxpayer and the consumer. And you're right to alert us to always highlight that risk. Even in the electricity sector itself, we talked about generation assets being very diverse and multiple. But even that, in that, there's a conundrum. If you look at it, some of the firms that actually supply government with power have locked contracts on PPP basis for a generation at very high rates. And that's why part of the legacy is already high costs of power, because they've been built in. Regardless of whether they're supplying that power or not, they get paid and they have very sweet deals that they continue to. Again, the absence of transparency. And some of those farms are not only owned by politically connected people, some of them were actually former workers in those sectors. So people in the Ministry of Energy, for instance, and their associates actually own some of the farms that are selling power to Kenya. So what that means that with the absence of transparency, many of them were negotiating with themselves, and that's what locks Kenya's power costs at a very high level to begin with. So yes, we completely guided about that, never to assume that just because somebody says I'm a government officer, we work as a regulator, we are examining the public interest necessary. So the significance of transparency, I think talking back to what Ben says, we actually think that anybody who's running a longer term contract with the government of Kenya needs an ex-post disclosure about what the terms of those things are, especially the financial terms, the real beneficiaries of the contract, whether they be foreigners or externally, and what risks will be borne by the public sector. So, for instance, the PPP framework in Kenya is rotten. People say it's best practice, but if you can see how it has been, all risks reside with the public sector. And those who supply, regardless of it, have sweet deals. And they have significant law firms who sometimes attend a conversation such as the one we have with the Institute of Economic Affairs, telling us about what the privacy rights, the proprietary rights, and how secrecy is essential for this. There's no reason for secrecy to be essential for this. One of the largest suppliers of power and of power globally. Governments based in Europe, and actually the contracts that they have with private firms supplying power to them are actually available for public security. So I'm not too sure why Kenya income per capita of less than $3,000 should claim that 2% of the sector in itself is such a significant secrecy question that a firm coming from London to negotiate with the government of Kenya should insist on foreign law for interpretation of the contract and at the same time for this. So yes, I'm preaching about this, but I think I'm just trying to persuade you and Ben that we have taken your point about understanding the political risks that go with whatever model of markets that we choose to always be in our minds. That's it. I'm very grateful for this conversation, and I'd like to remind you all that the IE is a membership organization. We allow professionals to become members so that you can participate, but also guide us on what kind of conversations you have. And as professionals as well, you have views. If you wish to be included in a platform such as this, we can do that as well, because the purpose of the IEA is to provide a platform for its members to educate the public, to educate themselves, but to also to isolate policy options which we may forward to government by framing the questions forward to government for policy reform. So thank you all for being here, and we hope that this has been a useful conversation for all of you. The presentation will be available. We have a write-up. It usually comes about 2 weeks or a little later, but we have a write-up which my two colleagues will write, and it will be available on the IA's website. If you'd like us to communicate with you, please send us an email, and we'll keep you on our mailing list so that you receive all the conversations and invitations to conversations such as this. And yes, we will look at a conversation on sanitation. It's a clear one, because in Kenya's national accounts, actually sanitation and energy are all put together. So sanitation and water is actually equivalent to another 1%, close to another 1% of GDP. It's about 0.75%. So it's also a big one. So yes, we are guided. Thank you very much, and we'll have that conversation too. Ladies and gentlemen, we're always grateful, and we thank you on behalf of the Institute of Economic Affairs. And also, I'd like you to just give a thumbs up to my two colleagues who did a fantastic presentation today, to encourage them and also for keep up this good work. Thank you very much, and have a good afternoon.